the only other job in an organization that is like the product manager in this sense of needing to know how it's built and how it's designed and how it's marketed and how it's sold and how it's funded is the CEO.
Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with thought leaders from not only the entrepreneurial domain, but also from the world of technology, psychology, philosophy, economics, politics, biology, management and leadership, health and fitness, and more to help you think in a multidisciplinary way. Avoid relying too heavily on the first piece of information encountered, and ultimately to make better informed decisions so that you can more readily become the person that you want to become. Each and every Friday, I'll also bring you Fast Fix Friday, some short, high impact and easily digestible insights to have you finishing your week on a high. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, creating a culture of innovation, or partnering with startups, visit www.collectivecampus.io. Without further ado, let's kick into today's episode. Welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 268 with Marty Cagan. Before founding the Silicon Valley Product Group to pursue his interests in helping others create successful products through his writing, speaking, advising, and coaching, Marty Cagan served as an executive responsible for defining and building products for some of the most successful companies in the world, including Hewlett-Packard, Netscape Communications, and eBay. Marty is the author of Inspired, How to Create Tech Products Customers Love, which explores lessons from top tech companies, how to get the right people on the bus, product management and development, and how to build a culture that underpins success. During his career, Marty has personally performed and managed most of the roles of a modern technology product organization, including product management, software development, product marketing, user experience design, software testing, engineering management, and general management. Marty speaks at major conferences and top companies across the globe and brings with him a wealth of knowledge from more than 3 decades in the industry. After spending the first half of this conversation riffing on what companies, in particular established incumbents, are doing wrong when it comes to building a truly innovative culture, we spent the second half exploring several case studies and some techniques that people in the industry can begin to employ to start breaking the inertia that almost 10 years after concepts like Agile and the Lean Startup started making waves seems to still be all too common in the modern organization. This is an incredibly worthwhile conversation for anybody involved in building new products or trying to build new products in an environment that perhaps isn't all that conducive to doing a good job of it. So please sit back, strap yourselves in, and enjoy my conversation with the one and only Marty Cagan. Welcome to the show, Marty.
Thanks very much, Steve.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and you're joining me all the way from sunny Colorado.
That's right.
So I've heard a lot of good things about Colorado in terms of its density when it comes to startups and entrepreneurship, in particular Boulder, Colorado, which from what I understand has a population of about 100,000 people, but punches way above its weight when it comes to the startup ecosystem and venture capital investment.
It is. I'm at the moment, I'm on the other side of Colorado in a small town in the mountains, but I have been to Boulder a few times, and it's a pretty nice community. But I'm from the Bay Area, San Francisco area.
Yep, fantastic. Well, we're having this conversation today because a few months ago you released a book called Inspired 2, How to Create Tech Products Customers Love, which was a follow-up to How to Create Products Customers Love from a few years prior. What are you hoping readers will get out of Inspired Mark II Marty?
Well, it was really the same. It's the same objective from the first edition, but the first edition came out literally 10 years ago, and in the tech industry, I know you know this. That's a long time. The vast majority of that first edition is still relevant. There's only a couple chapters I really sort of wish I didn't include, but
why is that?
Well, because what is considered best practice today is significantly further along than what it was 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, I was really trying to push people to Agile, push people to Lean Startup. And now virtually everybody has been practicing these techniques for a long time. Most of what I talked about is still relevant, and it's just that I think there's just way better ways of explaining really everything, and so it ended up being a complete rewrite. But the purpose of the book was really the same. It was really all about tech products. It was about tech products in the first edition, but there were still quite a few people from the non-tech world that got the book, and I just wanted to make clear to everybody that it's really about tech products.
Fantastic. And your book kicks off by telling a story of your time at HP in the mid-'80s, where you were a young software engineer. You had high hopes for for AI-enabled technology. And during this particular ordeal, shall we say, you learned a very valuable lesson. What was it?
Well, that it's just not all about engineering, and that it's really you need to make sure you have something worth building. It really doesn't matter how great your engineering talent is if you don't do that. So a lot of people have learned that lesson, not just me. Sure.
Yeah. So for our audience's benefit, what actually happened there at HP when you were a young engineer?
Well, ironically, it was HP's first AI technology product, and we were all very excited about that, and that's what I had studied at university. So it turned out to be, AI technology is only now coming to fruition. But the truth is, we did an AI product that was, decades premature, literally decades premature. There was just no market for that technology, and of course, the technology itself, even if there was a market, it was before the era of big data. There was a lot of the raw ingredients that really weren't there. But the point was, there was no market for this. There weren't customers waiting. And so even though I still have patents to my name based on that effort, there was some great technology. It's just great technology without a market is not very exciting.
Yeah, and fast forward almost 3 decades, and that whole notion of great technology without, commercial applications, it doesn't seem like a fair chunk of the business community has really moved on from that. We're still seeing multi-million-dollar failures, particularly amongst a lot of your more, say, traditional organizations who still tend to rely very heavily on outsourcing accountability to steering committees, which ultimately adds complexity and cost to things, and things can take a lot longer than was initially envisaged. And when all is said and done, that benefits realization that product teams often seek out just isn't there. And, you mentioned earlier, Agile and Lean Startup are being practiced by a lot of firms out in the valley and amongst firms in the startup ecosystem. But amongst your larger, more traditional firms, it seems like from where I'm sitting, a lot of them are still making those same mistakes.
Oh, they are. It is, to be honest, it's depressing at times how for so long we've known these things. And I see these problems, like you said, especially at pre-internet companies. But I have to also admit, I've seen the problems at modern companies, sometimes located just literally less than a mile from great companies like Google and Amazon, and they still are doing things in that old way. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. That's a long conversation. There are a lot of fundamental reasons why companies often don't work the way they really need to, and they often some of them they have no idea how good companies actually work and are really surprised to learn how they work. But other ones know how they work, and they still aren't willing to really embrace the differences. And it does, it's not necessarily easy. It does require hiring the right people. It requires really empowering teams, and requires a lot of senior management letting go more than they're used to and often comfortable with. And so it's not that I think it's, inexplicable. I think there are reasons for it. But the truth is, like you said, we still have just as many terrible products out there as ever.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And you mentioned there that there's managers who have no idea how companies should be run. Do you think that's a reflection of them not caring, or them not having been shown the literature, or having had the right conversations? What do you think that might be a reflection of, or is it all of the above?
It's all and more. I mean, it is our industry. I think this is really a statement about our industry, but it has not done a great job in sharing best practices. I think in most industries, academia plays a stronger role, but for various reasons in the technology industry, in my experience, the best companies are actually leading academia rather than following academia. So there isn't a good way to spread how when good teams really figure things out. It doesn't spread the way it does, say, in other industries. So the truth is, there's this big disparity, really a chasm between how great teams work and how most teams work.
Yeah, and I actually love what you said there, that the best companies lead academia rather than follow it. I think that's a really good takeaway. But on the book, I mean, we've kind of been talking about the fact that there's so many different variables that influence where companies are at today, whether they're good at building products or not so good at it. And in your book, you explore people, process, and culture. And I found that there was some parallels between that and what Clayton Christensen talked about in The Innovator's Dilemma way back in, I think it was 97, when he said that in order to build an innovative company, you need the alignment of resources, processes, and values. So when it comes to people, process, and culture, do product teams need to score high across all three areas to perform well, Marty?
Those three areas and more. One of the challenging things about tech products is you kind of need lots of things to go right. In other words, if anything goes wrong, you will probably have a failed product. So it does require quite a few things going right. You have to make sure you've got the skills on the team. You've got to make sure you've got a strong market. You've got to make sure the team knows how to actually discover a solution that people will buy and can figure out how to use, and your engineers can deliver and works for your business. You've got to do all these things successful to actually have a successful product. And that's, that includes the teams. It includes the leadership. It includes the culture. Yeah, you can see it's definitely hard.
Yeah, and I was actually having this conversation the other day about how a lot of, actually also wrote an article about it, how a lot of corporate innovation teams tend to just default to what's the simplest answer, Occam's razor, and they'll just run something like an idea challenge, collect ideas. They'll have a senior executive pick the winning idea, they will allocate a bit of funding, and of course it will go nowhere, because betting in one idea based on what people inside the building think is never really the best way to go about building a product. And, you've been talking about lean startups since Inspired One came out 10 years ago, but it's still not being applied. And, we've got inadequate resources in a lot of organizations, conflicting policies and procedures, misalignment of incentives, and oftentimes getting the wrong people on the bus. So it doesn't matter how good the environment is, how good the processes are, the resources, but if you've got people on the bus who either aren't skilled enough or just don't believe in the mission and don't care, there's only so far you can go. So I guess on that notion of teams, there's no secret that a talent war is raging when it comes to building tech products. What have you found when it comes to trying to attract and acquire high caliber talent to teams, if you don't necessarily have, say, the capital of someone like a Netflix whose whole HR policies pay at the top of the market?
Yeah, well, so when I work, most of what I do is advise startups and growth stage companies. And when I work with these companies, there's really a couple strategies out there that I think are both of them work. One is have a very high bar and make sure that you've got a strong interview team, and that would be the Netflix approach, or where you really do, you'd much rather have a much smaller organization of very, very strong, competent people. Even though, the truth is, this is true with Netflix too, despite the advertising, not everybody is a rock star at any of the best companies. There is a mix. At some point, you are going to have, I'm not suggesting you're lowering your standard, but I am suggesting you're going to get a lot more of a mix on in your organization. And then it becomes much more about how do you get ordinary people to do great results. And that's the other strategy, is how do you take strong people but that have probably never done it before and really help provide the context and the training that they need so that they can actually do great work. And there was some research actually done a few years ago by Google that looked at the highest performing product teams. And the surprise was that they're typically not the teams of rock stars. You'd think that if you just assemble from Google, does have a high bar, so there's a lot of talent there. If you just hire sort of an all-star team, that they would just consistently deliver, and it's really not the case at all. In fact, consistently, the better teams are those that have this other set of traits. So it's really more about how effective teams work together, and it's a lot less about that team of all-stars. And so that's what I usually encourage them to do. Make sure that they are getting the most out of their talent. Steve Jobs used to say, we didn't hire all these smart people in order to tell them what to do. But that's in fact what most of those companies, or the non-great companies, do, is they try to hire these really good people, and then they give them a roadmap and just say, go build.
Yeah, which isn't great when it comes to employee morale and whatnot, just telling people what to do, particularly if they are talented. I guess great leadership, if you read the literature, is all about helping get the best out of people and facilitating those outcomes, rather than just coming in and saying, okay, here's a list of directives, just go get it done.
One of the common problems out there is that, like you said in your scenario a few minutes ago, the management gets together and they say, they debate an idea and they say, let's build this, let's fund this. And that's exactly really the wrong approach. What you want to do is have the management focus on not the solution. Ideas are just potential solutions. But what's the problem? What is the need that we've got to go address? And then you want to really empower a team to try out many approaches to solve that. It will, in even the best organizations, it will take many approaches, many attempts before they figure out a solution that actually works.
Yeah, exactly right. People rarely get it right on the first attempt. And I think if you look at venture capital funnels as well, the number of startups that make it through to, say, that fifth round or that sixth round of funding, where they ultimately becomes a billion-dollar organizations, it's something like less than 1%. Yet when executives at these more traditional organizations are making those investment decisions, it seems like there's this preconceived idea that they're going to get it right on the first attempt, even though they haven't engaged a customer yet.
Yeah. No, it's a classic anti-pattern. The way the large organizations fund, when I say large, the large pre-internet companies, we're not talking about the Amazons or the Googles here, but the way they do it is just really archaic.
Yeah. And I guess just to sum up the conversation on teams, ultimately it's about building that champion team rather than a team of champions, which is a saying that comes right out of the world of sports. It's no different in when it comes to tech products and building teams in the tech space.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. We mentioned Lean Startup a few moments ago, and seems to be a running theme in this conversation thus far. I guess what I try to do on this show is also to explore the flip side and the contrary argument. And there's quite a few people in this space nowadays starting to push back a little bit when it comes to Lean Startup, because for example, in certain industries, you might go to market with, say, a quote-unquote half-baked product. And if the industry is small, you might burn your bridges and suffer from what people are now calling an MVP hangover, where some of the key people in your industry associate your brand with, say, a less than optimal product, and it can ultimately compromise your potential for success. So, I mean, what would you propose, or what do you think a smarter way of applying a lean startup is that won't result in that hangover?
Well, there's actually a backlash not just against lean startup, but also against agile. And at one level, they're absolutely right. The backlash, there are in fact, I'll be honest, the vast majority of teams I meet, they all tell me that they are agile and using lean startup. But when I actually look at what they're doing, they're really not doing either of them in any meaningful sense. So, this is kind of what happens I think it probably happens in all industries, but in the tech industry, it happens a lot. Something comes out like lean startup, or the other thing that's going on right now is design thinking. These are good techniques for what they're designed for, but the industry tends to want to treat it like a silver bullet. Yes. This is the thing that's going to solve all these problems, and inevitably it doesn't. None of those things do. In fact, I try to tell people, there is no one tool. You need many different techniques and tools for the job. Sometimes design thinking is exactly what we need. Sometimes a true MVP is exactly what we need. And they don't understand really what the technique is for and the right way to adopt it. And in fairness, there are the way minimum viable product, which is probably one of the most important concepts in the entire tech industry, the way it's explained by most people is really not good. And it's just very confusing. And so people get this idea, and they ship a really crappy product, a half-baked product, in about 4 or 5 months, and they call that MVP, and then they're frustrated because people don't like it, and their company's embarrassed by it. And I'm like, that is not even close to an MVP. That is just a bad product. That's all you've done. A true MVP, we can typically do MVPs in days or weeks, and they're not meant to be shipped to the general public. They're meant to be used to assess risk, whether that's value risk or usability risk or feasibility risk or viability risk. And so that's a whole conversation. We have more than 100 techniques just to try out different aspects of MVPs. And so most people are, again, unaware of what this is really about. They've just seen a video, or they've, read a book, and they think they know. And so, of course, they get in trouble, and then a year later, they throw it out as not workable.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, and I think it ties back into what I was saying earlier, that executives tend to look for the simplest solution because it's the one that, I suppose, creates the least cognitive load for us. And it's like, well, let's do something. And then we tend to conflate action with effectiveness and productivity, and it makes us feel busy, but ultimately the results aren't there. And, you said that with design thinking and lean startup and all these different tools and techniques, they serve a purpose, but they serve one role in a much greater, say, spectrum of end-to-end delivery. I mean, design thinking is great for coming up with that idea, but in terms of building that idea and taking it to market and ensuring that your organization has the right culture and processes and whatnot to support that on an ongoing period of time, that's a totally different beast. And it really just plays like 5 or 10% of the role. But so many executives see it as the silver bullet solution. And once you have that hammer, everything suddenly becomes a nail.
It's true, and I don't only blame the executives. I mean, if you look at the industry, every time something comes out, you have a whole bunch of consultants and books, and people will come out and sell themselves as a coach for you to do this, and it'll solve all these problems. It's just such a common pattern. We've seen it so many times.
So conscious that we're a little bit on the skeptical side here, Marty, so maybe we can amp it up and give our listeners some optimism. Your book's full of case studies and profiles of some of today's most successful product managers, and technology-powered companies. I mean, you've got case studies in there from Adobe, Apple, BBC, Google, Microsoft, Netflix, and a few others. Is there a story that immediately jumps out that you'd like to share with our audience, Marty?
I picked stories. I've actually been working with tech product teams now for 35 years, so I have lots of stories. That's probably what's different about me is I've been doing it so long and exclusively with tech product teams. And so I do know a lot of great teams. Some of those teams, a small subset of those teams, have really gone on to build iconic products. And so I decided to highlight the people behind some of the most iconic products. Like I featured the original product manager for Netflix, the original product manager for Google Adwords. These are just amazing stories, any of them really. Google Adwords, I think it did last year over $70 billion. And it's just outrageously successful, with off the charts margins. It's like printing money. But it's very few people know the backstory with that and how close Google came to not even doing the effort. The salespeople there didn't want it done and the engineers didn't want it done. And it really, like anything, it's hard. And it took somebody, in this case, a woman named Jane Manning, to figure out a solution that kept sales happy and kept engineering happy, didn't really dilute the results with advertising and didn't cannibalize the sales for the sales organization, and came up with a pretty amazing solution that turned out to be, certainly orders of magnitude more successful than even they dreamt could be possible. So, but that's, I'll tell you that there's a story like that behind every great product. I find that it's always hard. There's always challenges. At Netflix, they were almost out of money, almost went bankrupt. They actually they tried to sell themselves to Blockbuster, if you remember Blockbuster and anyway, they were close to dying, but they figured out a solution that was pretty awesome, and it ended up carrying them for 7 years, and then they totally disrupted themselves again and created really the Netflix we know today. And the point is that it is always hard, but in every case, I know that there are these teams that just figure it out. Product design, engineering, they sit together and they figure it out. And that's really what product is about. It's combining those skill sets together to come up with a solution that people actually want to buy and they can figure out how to use and we can actually build and is legal to sell. I mean, if you think of things like Uber and Airbnb, it's got to be something that, works within the laws of New York City or the zoning restrictions of San Francisco or whatever it might be. And this is all hard, but that's what product is.
Yeah, definitely. And on that Jane Manning story, Marty, I think that's something worth fleshing out because Google by that point had a product. Like you said, they've had their sales teams, their engineering teams, and Jane wanted to introduce something that wasn't all about just delivering on the existing business model. It was about discovering something new. But a lot of people, such as your sales guys and your engineers, don't want to dilute results. They don't want to cannibalize the existing product. How did she actually go about getting that buy-in from the firm? Was there any specific takeaways that our listeners can get out of that story that they might be able to apply? Because a lot of firms that I work with, one of the big challenges I get, a lot of the pushback that I hear from people is that when they try and do something new, the sales guys won't let them get in front of their customers, for example, or the engineers won't support it. So what might they try to take out of that particular example to move the needle in their own organizations?
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of good lessons that are true, not just with that early AdWords product, but most of the products. So there are always objections. They don't always come from the same place, but there are always objections. Yeah. And sometimes they're really tough objections. They might be driven by regulations, like EU's got some new laws that are throwing a wrench into a lot of product efforts right now. But there's always something. And so, first of all, I think it takes somebody, and I focus a lot of my effort on the product manager. In truth, what I really care about are product teams, which is product management, user experience design, and engineering. So those three kind of have to work together to solve these problems. But the design and engineering is pretty well understood, but product is often not well understood. And the first lesson is, the product person has to really do their homework. They really have to understand all of these constraints on the business: financial, marketing, sales. And that's exactly what Jane started with. She sat down to really understand what was it that was so bothering the engineers. And she was able to understand pretty quickly what was bothering them, and it was legitimate. Most advertising was really bad back then, and they were working around the clock to make Google search results better than anybody's, and they were succeeding. And so the last thing they wanted to do was throw that all away by littering their results with a bunch of irrelevant ads. So they were nervous about that, and they were also. She sat down to understand what was it that was bothering the salespeople so much, and she understood that. There's a name for it in our industry. It's called cannibalization. This is where the sales force worries that they're actually undermined by their own organization that has a different product. And so she understood that, and she really sat down with the leaders of sales and the leaders of engineering to understand what their concerns were. One of the she did a lot of. It wasn't just her, but she especially did a lot of smart things to pull that off. And one of the things she needed to do, because at Google, really, the engineers are very powerful. And personally, I think this is a good thing. But if the engineers are not convinced, it's not going to get built. Now, that's not the case in a lot of banks and old companies. If the engineers aren't convinced, they're replaced with engineers that'll build whatever you tell them to. But in great companies, no, they do need to be convinced. I personally think this is a good thing. So it made her really work on her case, her argument. One of the things she did is she went to one of the most respected engineers in the company, and she argued the problem, not the solution. She argued the problem, which was really helping these small businesses get access to search results. And it's like, don't you think we should be able to have a good solution for this? And this engineer absolutely agreed with her. And she said, well, okay, because, I'm glad you agree this is a real problem. Can you help me convince the engineers that this is a real problem? And he did. He did help them understand that. And once they were really on board with it's a problem, then they started this much more interesting conversation about, well, what's a solution that would actually work for customers and not hurt our experience for our users? And that's what they came up with. And that's the kind of work that good product people do.
Well, I guess it's true what they say. It doesn't matter what role you're in. We're all in sales. And just looking at some of the tactics that Jane applied there, like firstly, identifying the objections. That's something a good salesperson does to understand what's going to prevent a deal from closing, and then how can you structure that deal so it goes forward. And then also doing what good marketers do, which is influencer marketing, and finding out who's influential in your space, who can influence the buyers. In this case, it was one of the more respected engineers, and she had that conversation with him, and then he was able to then influence the rest of the engineers. So I think that's an interesting sort of parallels there between sales, marketing, and trying to get that buy-in internally.
Yes. And like I said, there's always obstacles. In every case, there are always obstacles. It's just, if it was easy, somebody would have done it a long time ago. So this is really what product teams do, is they come up with solutions that really work for customers and for the business.
Yep, definitely. And just wanted to revisit something you said a short while ago in the conversation, which was around Agile and Lean Startup, and how teams purport to be applying it, but they're not really applying it. It's kind of like when they say, we're applying Scrum, but it's Scrum, but you're not really applying it to the letter of the law. Now, some organizations and some people will say, well, we're applying it and appropriating it for our for the nuances of our organization and culture. But at what point does that appropriation start to lose the underlying sort of spirit of what Agile is, to the point where you're not really getting the value anymore?
Yeah, well, recently I actually wrote about an example of this. And I want to be clear, this isn't what I meant when I was talking about people not doing Agile, even more basic benefits of Agile. But there are processes out there. If you've ever heard of SAFe, it stands for Scaled Agile Framework. These are processes that purport to sort of be Agile, but really, in my opinion, it is a complete marketing ploy. There is no Agile there, that in no meaningful sense. It is very much a command and control return to the 1980s, early 1990s. And I understand why in a lot of big banks and insurance companies that appeals to them. But I also have absolutely no hope they will get the level of innovation and speed out of it that they think they do need, but they're not going to get it. So that's an easy one to draw the line. What I was talking about is even more basic. Teams that are really trying to do, for example, Scrum is not hard to do. It's usually where most teams start. It is not hard, and it does provide real value. It doesn't solve the hard problems in our industry, but it does provide real value. When I find teams that are not at least using Scrum, I will usually sort of embarrass them into moving forward, because at this point, there's really no excuse not to. But you can absolutely be following Scrum to the letter of the law, all the rituals, and not getting any of the benefits. The classic example of that is they're supposedly an Agile team. They're doing sprints, but they're given a roadmap, a quarterly roadmap of everything they're supposed to build. So what is that? That's not Agile in any meaningful sense. It does get you a little bit of benefits, because now you're breaking things up into sprints and iterations, which is better than not doing that. But, what we're talking about there is maybe 10 or 20% the value of Agile, really. So that's there's a lot of examples of this, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I guess the fair chunk of the value of Agile is in that adaptability and flexibility that comes with changing tact as you are running these sprints, as opposed to committing to, okay, here's everything we're going to build for the next 3 months, regardless of what comes back.
Exactly.
So I wanted to just go down the product manager rabbit hole for a second, Marty. And one of the more polarizing sort of conversations in product for a few years now has been this whole notion of whether the product manager is the quote unquote CEO of the product. What's your take on this?
Well, it's a controversial one. And I should also admit, when I first heard this, it was more than 20 years ago, and I worked for Netscape, which you probably heard of. And Netscape first thing to know is it had some amazing product people. Ben Horowitz was there as we both worked for Mark Andreessen. The CEO was a guy named Jim Barksdale, who is the epitome of a great high integrity CEO. So put yourself back into that scenario. Back then, being the CEO of a product is like all good. That is an honor and a privilege, and it meant, be this person. What it meant was somebody who understands all elements of the business and is really driving with the team to come up to a successful solution. It was never meant to be that they are the boss of anybody. The reason that metaphor has struggled in the last decade or so is because, sadly, in the tech industry, many CEOs are not like Jim Barksdale. They are, jerks. There's no other way to put it. And there are some product managers that have thought that that's what it means to be the product manager, that they get to be that sort of jerk on the team. And I want to be honest, I know some product managers like that. But that said, that reaction caused most people, most, let's say, leaders in the product community to back off of that analogy and say, no, they're not the CEO of the product. They're just a member of the product team. And in my opinion, that has contributed to the increased struggles with the role of product manager. Because now we got people that were scared to be leaders and scared to really do their job. So recently I came out publicly and said, no, the product manager does need to be the CEO of the product. That does not mean that they're boss of anybody. They're not. It doesn't give them any rights or privileges above anybody else. But it does mean that the only other job in an organization that is like the product manager in this sense of needing to know how it's built and how it's designed and how it's marketed and how it's sold and how it's funded is the CEO. And that really is product manager, CEO. Those are the roles that are responsible for that breadth of knowledge about the business and the customers and the ecosystem. And so I have been trying to encourage people, no, you need to step up and be the CEO of your product. Mm-hmm. The other thing I should mention that's going on here is, in the last 10 years, as we just talked about, most organizations have moved to Agile, which I think is a good thing. The bad thing, though, is that most product managers today, the only training they have had is a certified Scrum product owner class, a CSPO class. And that is maybe 10% of the job of a product manager. And so the result of this, one of the consequences, unintended consequences of moving to Agile is that we have more, I put it this way, less trained product managers, I would argue, than ever. And this has caused a real backlash because the real CEO of the company is looking at these product owners and saying, they are not even close to the CEO of a product. They are more like project managers. What are we doing here? And they're right. And so there's really two battles I'm trying to wage along those lines. One is to make sure product managers know that product owner responsibility is just a tiny portion of their responsibility, and that they also need to understand what really distinguishes a product manager is being the CEO of the product.
And just like a good CEO or a good leader of any persuasion, the product manager should be about not directing but facilitating outcomes. And like you said, having that CSPO is 10% of the battle. I mean, they need to understand the customer, they need to understand the commercial aspects of the business, they need to be able to have conversations with engineers, with designers. They need to understand UX. Like, there's so many different components that go into it. And unless you can see things holistically, then you're not going to be very good at facilitating those outcomes because you're not going to have the best conversations or understand where the product needs to go.
Exactly right.
So on the product manager and on speaking with customers, should the product manager be attending every user interview? I mean, is that how far down the rabbit hole the product manager should go as far as getting that nuanced understanding of customer needs is concerned?
Oh, that's an easy one. Absolutely. In fact, it's really hard to argue that anything else is more valuable for a product manager. Don't get me wrong. Again, there's a lot of things they need to do, but it really starts with deep understanding of your users and customers. Now, the designers are there too, obviously, and the designers but they're really looking at, we're talking to the same users and customers, but we're really learning different things and focused on different things. The designers are really trying to come up with something that these users can understand and figure out how to use. And that can be very hard in its own right. Product managers trying to understand more holistically what's going on. How do they make a purchase decision? Who are the influencers? Who are the approvers? How do they actually fund this thing? And how is it actually going to be deployed? And what are the systems it's going to replace? And what kind of migration challenges are there? And 1,000 other things. And so if the product manager is not there at every single user engagement, customer interview, to me, this is not a product manager. They are not a product manager.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. Always start with the customer. A couple of other things I just wanted to touch or double click on, if you will, in this conversation, Marty, was this notion of high integrity commitments, which you've proposed as something that can replace the need to commit to a hard date. What's that all about?
Well, it's just this is one of those things in Agile actually doesn't come from the product community. It comes from the custom software world. And in the custom software world, it's hard too in its own way, but it is different. In the product world, we've got, there are real dates that matter, like Apple's turning out a new version of the iOS. We can't change that. Our stuff has to run on that when it's available. Or the holidays, Christmas is not moving. And so if you're an e-commerce company, you've got to make sure everything's ready by a few weeks before Christmas when the systems are going to be at their biggest demand, things like that. We have a lot of reasons for needing a real date. And a lot of the Agile purists will sort of scoff at the idea of a real date, but we really do have this situation. Not all the time, but they exist. And so we need a way to actually have what's called a high integrity commitment. That means that not only do we know we can deliver it when we say, but we also know it's going to actually work for the customer. And so this idea of a high integrity commitment has been around a while. And it's not that hard to do. It's a little bit of a give and take. What it usually entails is that we have to do enough discovery on the commitment we're being asked to do. Discovery is just the name we give to when we're figuring out the product that we need to deliver. So discovery is figuring out the product, and delivery is building it and testing it and deploying it, QA testing it and deploying it. That's all. So we'll do the necessary discovery to make sure we know if we can deliver on this commitment and when we can deliver on this commitment. And then once we have reasonable confidence on that commitment, we'll make that commitment, and then we'll deliver on it, of course, as well.
So earlier in the conversation, Marty, you mentioned that you worked at Netscape with Mark Andreessen, and you asked whether or not I remember Netscape, and I do. I mean, I'm 34 now, so my first internet browser was in fact Netscape Navigator way back in, I think it was 1995 or 96, something to that effect. But I mean, you've been there, you've lived through it. You were there at the start of the commercial internet. New technologies were being invented almost constantly, and now it seems like we're going through that again. We've got blockchain, we've got AR, VR, there's CRISPR-Cas9, IoT, big data, you name it. Everything's happening. And a lot of these technologies seem to be, I suppose, threatening, if you will, to change the face of business and life again. I mean, how do you find this particular period today compares with the hustle of the early 90s? Well,
yeah. Well, it's funny because just a couple of years ago, we had the 20-year reunion for Netscape, and none of us could really believe it had been 20 years because it just went so fast. I do think, I was in the technology industry for a good amount of years, even before the internet, and change was constant then too. But the internet definitely accelerated things. I don't see it really just as the late 90s were a big push, and then now it's been constant. I do think, especially with machine learning technologies, which are like, depending on how you count, the third or fourth or fifth incarnation of that, but I feel like it's real now, finally. And that is generating a lot of excitement and activity in the teams I work with. It's already starting to show up in really impressive places. So that it's not so much, I think, that the velocity of the change as much as some technologies do have broader impact than others. And machine learning is one of those. With blockchain technology, it's still it's much earlier than it is, I would argue, than with the AI. I do think it's going to have profound impact, but in truth, I'm more worried about the criminal applications of it than the good applications of it. That's one that's got a lot of yellow flags going on. But that's another discussion. But the point is, yes, the technologies are changing constantly. That's really what, to me, is attractive about the technology industry. And I always warn people, if you don't like change, this is a terrible industry to get into, because really everything, the half-life of the technology is maybe a couple years. So it is always reinventing. And to me, that's what makes it interesting, because in product, it's all about combining real customer pain and needs with what's just now possible. And since what's just now possible is always changing, there's always a lot of great product work to do. So, I don't really see that. I don't see it slowing down or changing or stopping.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess on blockchain and the criminal applications, I guess throughout history, we've seen whenever there's been some sort of disruptive emerging communications technology or transactional technology, oftentimes it is the criminals who get on board first, but hopefully over time things balance out and we have net good and we figure out how to regulate it effectively without compromising the underlying value of the technology, which would be a shame to see if we regulate it prematurely and a lot of the potential profound implications that you're alluding to don't come to fruition. But on AI, obviously you said earlier in the show that this is something you studied and you've worked in the space for quite a while in various capacities. It seems like forever, and I think it was Tim Harford, the author of books like Messy, who I had on the show a while ago, and he was talking about how since the 60s, we've always said that general AI is 20 years away. And even today, people are like, well, it's probably, 20 years away. I mean, what are your thoughts, Marty?
Yeah, well, the first thing I should say is it's been several years since I was actively studying in that area. And so I am not but I have been reading a lot on this, and there's been some very good articles that try to put all this in perspective. What most people talk about as AI is not nearly the general AI. And the point is, we don't even need the general AI to do the kinds of really very impressive things, most of which that are going on right now are not general AI and don't need to be. So I wouldn't. That doesn't bother me in the least.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very, very succinctly put. Well, thank you so much, Marty. You've left our audience with a lot of value bombs, but before you go, we've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to just throw you into our 3-question lightning round. Are you ready to rock?
Sure.
Let's do it. So question number 1, Marty, is given your wealth of experience in the space of technology, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why? Well,
I will tell you there's some really cool companies, and if I could be at SpaceX, I think I would be. I'd love SpaceX. I also deeply admire Tesla.
Yeah. Would that be now or during the early days when everyone told them that what they were doing was crazy and it couldn't be done?
I still hear that about SpaceX, and it's any point in time there, I love that they're tackling something very hard, and I love how disruptive they continue to be.
Yeah, and I think they're just a great case study to point to when people say something can't be done. Well, here it is. Like, here's the attitude and just belief that one needs to have just to push forward, because if you don't, then we'll just stay stagnant and won't have these breakthrough innovations. So I think it's a great case study. And I often speak to SpaceX launching, I think it was the Falcon 9 rocket into orbit 3 times, exploded 3 times in a row. And then they had almost no money in the bank, just enough to launch one more time, and boom, got into orbit. And that was like just such an awesome case study. So question number 2, Marty, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
That's a really hard question. Anybody. That's a very broad set of people. And even in the realms. I got a chance to meet Steve Jobs a couple times, but I would have loved like the opportunity to have like a dinner. No, I'll tell you somebody that there is a guy that I would have loved to have been able to sit down over dinner. His name was Bill Campbell. He was known as the coach of Silicon Valley. He literally did coach Steve Jobs for 20 years. He would literally coach Larry and Sergey at early Google for decades. And I never was lucky enough to be coached by him directly, but I actually learned a lot of what I know from people that were coached directly by him. So I feel like indirectly he's really helped me, and he certainly helped our industry in a big way. And I would have loved to have that kind of quality discussion with him.
Fantastic. Seems like a bit of an unsung hero underpinning all the success of the Silicon Valley technology firms.
He is probably the greatest person that nobody knows.
Yeah. Well put. And lucky last, you've been obviously in the scene for a few decades now. You've been writing books, coaching, speaking, all sorts of good stuff. Do you have any daily rituals or routines, Marty, that help you stay on top of your game?
I'll share a little tip. Because it is hard to keep up with the technology industry. You know that. Anybody who's trying knows it's hard. There is a blogger that I follow religiously. His name is Ben Thompson. Mm-hmm. He writes a blog, publishes a blog called Stratechery, which is a goofy name, but it's STRATECHERY.com. It's a subscription blog service, and he is probably my favorite industry analyst for the tech industry. And he shares his insights every day. And first of all, that's all he does. So I'm able to leverage. He covers most of the industries that I work with. And I'll also admit he is a much better strategic thinker than I am. So I learn a lot by reading his analysis.
Fantastic. So that was Stratechery. I think we'll add that to the show notes for our listeners, because that just sounds like a glowing endorsement. So something hopefully our listeners can benefit from. So thank you so much, Marty. You've provided a wealth of value for our listeners. You've imparted a lot of wisdom. Do you have any parting words of wisdom before we wrap up?
No, I hope that was useful. And thanks very much, Steve, for the invitation.
Not a problem. Well, people can pick up a copy of the book and books on Amazon, and where all good books are sold. They can find you on Twitter at Cagan, and of course they can find out more about your company at svpg.com. Thank you so much, Marty. Hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
And you. Thank you.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe, and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, please take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play or Spotify. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. Until next time, Future Squared is out.